Hi class, in this recording we're going to dive in and introduce the immune system. So without further ado, let's get to it. As we look at our immune system, we need to keep in mind that we're not really who we think we are. You may think you're a human being, but you're more like a receptacle for bacteria. For every human cell, it's estimated that we have about 10 bacterial cells in our bodies. Most of them, and not just some, I should say, the vast majority are good for us, are beneficial. However, there's some that are potentially disease-causing. And this is a key word here, potentially disease-causing, because the bacteria in our bodies can morph. They can go from non-pathogenic to pathogenic, or if you move them from your colon to, let's say, your bloodstream, that would be bad. So depending on where they are or how they're behaving, they may or may not be disease-causing. Now, to help keep those bacteria in check, we have our immune system. And this immune system is not an organ system. Instead, it's just a bunch of cells in our bodies. And these cells are going to be all over the place in all organs and all tissues to help to defend these tissues and organs from pathogens, things that cause disease. As we look at the immune system, it's going to be very intimately, not intricately, but intimately related to the lymphatic system, which is an organ system. There are actual tissues and organs associated with the lymphatic system. And as we look at the lymphatic system, it's going to have a bunch of organs that are going to be similar to veins. These vessels that are similar to veins recover excess extracellular fluid. They concentrate any substances that may be filtered out to be inspected for disease potential, and then if needed helps to activate our immune response and then return that excess extracellular fluid to the bloodstream. As we look at this fluid recovery portion of our lymphatic system, we are going to have lymphatic capillaries shown here. Here we have lymphatic capillaries in green. The lymphatic capillaries are open-ended. They receive extracellular fluid, and the moment that extracellular fluid goes into the lymphatic capillary, we are going to recategorize it as lymphatic fluid. Most of the excess extracellular fluid is going to be reabsorbed by our blood capillaries. However, as we look at this, these lymphatic capillaries are going to absorb about 2 to 4 liters a day. So about half a gallon to 1 gallon, or 15% of our water is going to be absorbed every single day. And about half of our plasma proteins that enter into the lymphatic system are going to ultimately be returned back into the bloodstream. Another function or a key aspect of our immune and lymphatic systems are the immune aspects. So we need to take that excessive fluid that's been picked up by the lymphatic system, and we're going to filter out foreign bodies, foreign objects. And then as they are filtered, they are going to aggregate within the lymph nodes. And within the lymph nodes, we have lots of immune cells. If they find those immune cells in the lymph nodes find a pathogen that does not belong in the lymphatic fluid, those cells can activate the immune response. Our lymphatic system also aids us with lipid absorption. Within our small intestine, so here's our small intestine, the small intestine is lined with villi, and those villi are going to have in the center of them a lacteal. And this lacteal is a branch of a lymphatic capillary that is used to absorb lipids. Carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids go into the blood capillaries of these villi, but the lipids that we absorb, so dietary lipids that we absorb, don't go into the blood, they go into the lymphatic system instead. Within our lymphatic system, we have a lot of lymph, the fluid that we have recovered that's been reabsorbed into the lymphatic vessels. Those lymphatic vessels are going to transport lymph throughout our body, typically to lymph nodes. We also are going to have lymphatic tissues. And when we talk about lymphatic tissues, these are tissues that have high concentration of lymphocytes and macrophages. These lymphocytes and macrophages are some of the kinds of white blood cells, or leukocytes, that we've talked about. We also have lymphatic organs. The lymphatic organs have high concentrations of white blood cells in them, especially high concentrations. And these lymphatic organs are going to be separated by a capsule made of connective tissue so that they are structurally distinct from the surrounding tissues. Some examples of lymphatic organs that we can see on this screen include red bone marrow. Well, that would actually be more of a lymphatic tissue, but a lymphatic organ would be a lymph vessel, aka a lymph node. So as we look at lymph, and we'll dive into each of these topics that we talked about in the last slide in more detail. Lymph is clear, colorless, and it is a fluid. It's very similar to blood plasma, but it has a lot less protein because the protein within lymph, because if we think of lymph comes from extracellular fluid. Where does extracellular fluid come from? That comes from blood plasma. And most proteins are going to remain within our blood plasma. They aren't going to leave the blood capillaries. So the proteins that are in the extracellular fluid ultimately make it into the lymphatic capillaries, and then they become lymph proteins. As we look at the chemical composition of lymph, depending on where we are in the body, small intestine versus lymph nodes, we can have slightly different chemical compositions of that lymphatic fluid. Now, as we look at these lymphatic capillaries are almost everywhere in our body. There's just a few tissue types that don't have them. Generally speaking, if we are going to work with an avascular tissue, we're typically not going to have lymphatic capillaries in there, as a good rule of thumb. So as we look at cartilage, the cornea of our eye, the lens of our eyes, bone and bone marrow is a little odd in that we don't have lymphatic capillaries in those tissue types, but they are highly vascularized. And as we look at these lymphatic capillaries, you could think of these as the tendrils that suck up excessive fluid. The goal of these lymphatic capillaries is to make sure that we don't have too much water being retained in our tissues. And as we look at the walls of these lymphatic capillaries, they're made of endothelial cells that have a slight overlap, which gives us a one-way valve function of them. And as we look at the one-way valve function, it means that liquid can enter into the lymphatic capillaries, but it cannot exit the lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries are closed off at one end. Fluid goes in, but it doesn't go out of these lymphatic capillaries the way it came. It has to flow through the entire network. To help anchor these lymphatic capillaries into the tissues, we're going to have some protein filaments, shown in this figure in black. And as we look at these cells, the gaps between the endothelial cells that make up the lymphatic vessels are so large that bacteria and other cells, other foreign cells, can enter into the lymphatic capillaries. The endothelium overlap is going to, let me clear the screen here and shift to red. So here we have a bit of an overlap between those endothelial cells, and this overlap allows for a valve-like flap to form that allows for extracellular fluid to enter, but it does not allow for lymphatic fluid to leave. Now, as we look at our lymphatic vessels, eventually they become larger and larger, and we'll have three separate layers. These three separate layers mimic or mirror the layers of the blood vessels. We have the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. And the tunica interna is made up of an endothelium with valves, and hopefully you should be thinking of veins at this point because lymphatic vessels and veins are very similar to each other. They have very thin walls, they're very flexible, they have hardly, they're very flaccid, and they both have these one-way valves that are present within them. As we look at the tunica media of the lymphatic vessels, they have both elastic fibers and smooth muscles, again, just like veins. And the tunica externa is a thin outer layer of connective tissue that anchor it into place. And these lymphatic vessels converge into larger and larger vessels. And as they become larger and larger vessels, they pause and go through lymph nodes, where solid substances will be filtered out of the lymphatic fluid. As we look at our body, we have 6 lymphatic trunks that drain the major portions of our bodies. These 6 major trunks include the jugular, subclavian, bronchiomediastinal, intercostal, intestinal, and lumbar trunks. Those 6 trunks are going to ultimately drain into 2 collecting ducts. These 2 collecting ducts are the last stop before lymphatic fluid is drained back into the circulatory system. We have the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. As we look at the right lymphatic duct is going to receive fluid from the right arm, the right side of the head, right side of thorax, and empties into the right subclavian vein. And I really wish this other one was called the left lymphatic duct, but it's not, which just irritates me. The thoracic duct is larger and longer. It travels all the way through the thorax. It begins at a very prominent sac called the cisterna capillaries, and it's going to receive lymphatic fluid from the rest of the body, anywhere that the right lymphatic duct does not receive lymphatic fluid from. And the subclavian veins, so the thoracic duct drains into the left subclavian vein. Both subclavian veins, left and right, are located at the top of the thorax. And we talked about those in our last unit when we covered the circulatory systems. So check out this figure. As we look at this, we see that we have on the right side of the body drainage from the right lymphatic duct into the right subclavian vein, and then over here on this side of the body we have the thoracic duct, which starts right here at the cisterna capillaries and extends all the way up through the thoracic cavity into the left subclavian vein and drains lymphatic fluid from everywhere else in the body. We also should mention and emphasize here that lymph nodes tend to be aggregated in different regions of the body. The cervical lymph nodes, the axillary lymph nodes, and the inguinal lymph nodes. We tend to have a higher concentration of lymphatic nodes in those areas of our bodies.